The second one is about missions. In your sermons, Pastor John, books and talks, we hear you say a lot about missions. How can settled churches that are doing what they do for years now bring the urgency back towards missions? What is your advice to those pastors among us who find themselves part of a church with no real heart for missions? What has gone wrong, and how can we bring missions back on track?
I'm assuming that most of us in this room are more or less reformed in our soteriology. That is, the mark of the Reformed, Warfield wrote, was that they put the glory of God at the center of everything. They put the glory of God above everything. Humans are not the main thing. God is the main thing. That's kind of the feel of the Reformed, and I love it. I wasn't born into that kind of situation. I came to see God that way. Later, I've never lost my love for the God-centeredness of God. Okay, which means that when I came to Bethlehem as a 34-year-old in 1980, I preached that. I preached the greatness of God. I tried to put God in people's lives, lift God up, make him great so that they could live out of that fullness. About 3 years into that ministry, God did an amazing thing. He did it for Tom Steller, my associate, and he did it for me, and he did it independently, which is why we sensed keenly that it was of God, besides being biblical. He showed us. Tom woke up in the middle of the night during missions week. We had a missions week that we inherited. We didn't make it. We inherited it. It was there before we came to the church. And he woke up in the middle of the night, couldn't sleep, and he turned on a song by John Michael Talbot. That was 30 years ago, 30 years, 35 years. John Michael Talbot, and the song was about the glory of God filling the earth. And he wept for an hour, he said to me. And he wept because he saw that the theology I had taught him, he was my student, he's 10 years younger than I am, he was my student. I had taught him God-centered theology from Ephesians 1 unto the praise of the glory of his grace, everything. And he saw that his life and his attitude toward the nations did not correspond to that theology. He was out of sync. God was big, no burden for the nations. That is absolutely irrational. It's insane. To have a God who created the entire world for his glory and not to have a burden for about 17,000 people groups who do not magnify God is inconsistent. He did the same thing to me because that year, it was the first time they asked me to preach at our own missions conference. Usually we had guest preachers come in for missions, They know missions, I don't know missions, and I don't do missions, they do missions, I do other stuff. And they said, you preach at missions this year. And so I was preaching this series that became Desiring God. And I called it The Battle Cry of Christian Hedonism, which is a chapter in the book. And God, as I was preparing that sermon, he just kept saying, you're out of step, Piper. You have not thought through your God-centered theology in regard to the nations of the world. If the people who have the biggest God ought to have the biggest vision for the nations of the world. So my advice is, if you love the greatness of God, then simply get alone with God and ask him, how consistent am I when I think about, talk about, plan for, feel about the nations, the people groups of the world? Do they carry weight for me because they don't yet magnify King Jesus? And in fact, Revelation 5:9 says, now those of us who are Reformed, who love the L in TULIP, the most controversial letter in TULIP is L, limited atonement or particular redemption. If you love that, which I do, you will love Revelation 5:9, and you will love missions. Because Revelation 5:9 says, you were slain, and by your blood you purchased people for God from every nation. That's different than saying you purchased every nation. You purchased people for God from every nation and made them a kingdom, priests to our God, and they shall reign on earth. Every people, tongue, tribe, and nation. So whatever that means, people, tongue, tribe, nation, missiologists say there are about 17,000 of those, depending on how you define them linguistically and culturally. There's a lot of them. And if you go to joshuaproject.net online, which I have on my phone, pray for a different people group every day, they'll tell you exactly who the unreached and unengaged peoples are. We're not ignorant anymore. William Carey could be excused because he was ignorant. His map that he put on his wall before he went out to India was crazy wrong and wonderful because it motivated him to go. He had his numbers all wrong. He didn't know what he was talking about, but he got the best numbers he could, right? India needs Jesus. Well, today, northern India still needs Jesus. There are probably 3,000 people groups in India that don't know the gospel. So all I'm saying is to be a powerfully motivated and motivating pastor in missions, don't preach missions first, preach the God of missions. Preach the God of the nations. Declare his glory among the nations, his marvelous works among all the peoples. That's the text to choose in Psalm 96. Declare his glory among the nations, his marvelous works among all the peoples. That text says we should do that. And if you care about his glory and his marvelous works, then you're going to do it. And I just think I have found in mobilizing missions that pastors feel discouraged because you are so consumed with the immediate pressures. I mean, the people in Holland need Jesus. Your neighbors need Jesus. Your family needs Jesus. There are people who need counseling. All kinds of things burdening down pastors. And here comes John Piper and says, get a vision for world missions. That's what oh, good night. Another burden that I'm supposed to carry. My experience has been that if you simply build it in to your preaching, it's not like this added extra thing, just build it in, there's going to be pockets of people in your congregation that come alive to this. And you're not asking everybody to be a missionary. You need to know that. You don't want them all to be missionaries. That's unbiblical to tell them all to be missionaries. But God has a handful of people in every church who are just waiting for you to set them on fire with one or two sermons a year that highlight this or then illustrate along the way during the year. And I found it was energizing rather than being an added burden.